guys, this is Professor Vitt coming to you from the basement. I'm sorry about the back wall. There's not anything up there yet, but there will be. In the garage, I have a lot of stuff, but this just kind of came together. So this video is the critical thinking tattoo. It's kind of a toolkit or a roadmap for the whole course, so you get some idea how these different concepts fit together. Let's start with our very first picture here. It is the claim being made. So we're going to draw our skeptical eye here to the claim being made. And what that really means is when someone makes a claim, we want to be skeptical of the claim if it's appropriate. So the first thing we need to know is this person making a claim, right? Is anything actually being said? And so if something is being said, then we need to be clear on what that claim is. So here I'm asking, what claim is someone making? Well, let's look at an example here from 1974, just a year before I was born. At the end of a day's work in 1974, workers for the Dowling Construction Company of Indianapolis left a 2.5-ton steel wrecking ball hanging from a crane 200 feet above the ground. Obviously, you wouldn't need to lock it down. When they came back the next morning, the ball was gone. Police and all concerned were baffled, and the ball was never found. Okay, now the source for this is a book called Mysteries of the Unexplained, but it's based on a telephone interview with Lauren Dowling. That's where I first heard of the claim, but it turns out I found some sources outside, but we'll talk about that. So, what is this story saying? It sounds like a very bizarre occurrence, right? What is being said here? Well, in 1974, a super duper heavy wrecking ball disappeared in Indianapolis. We're not claiming that ghosts took it. We're not claiming that aliens took it. And we're not saying that the employees were committing some kind of insurance fraud. We're just saying the ball disappeared, right? Now that's strange, right? In some way, it's kind of bizarre to have something like that happen. But in order to really evaluate this claim, we're going to have to adopt a new rule. So we're moving on to the second picture here. Once we're clear on what someone is saying, right? And again, we don't want to push them into saying more than what has actually been expressed. So remember, this person isn't claiming that aliens took the wrecking ball, just that it disappeared. Now, ACREE is a really fancy, it's an acronym, I guess you'd say, excuse me. Yeah, it's a phrase that is built upon a rule, and the rule is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The way to think about this is like a scale. If the claim is really crazy, then the evidence is going to have to be really crazy. And if the claim is fairly mundane, then the evidence for it can be mundane. So an example I'll use later in lecture is if I claim that Teddy Roosevelt if I claim that I flew to work, right? I flew to Long Beach City College for work. You might think that's pretty unusual. And so you'd want to see, well, how do we know this, right? I mean, does he have a Snapchat of it? Did other people see him get off a plane in the middle of a Veterans Stadium, right? You'd kind of think it was unusual, and you might not be inclined to believe that I flew to work. Now, if I said I drove to work, that would be fine. You probably wouldn't need any evidence for that. Now suppose I say I flew to work, but not in a plane, but I actually pumped my arms and I started working it and I got it all done and ta-da, right? I fly into work under my own power. Now that would be really extraordinary, right? And so you'd want a lot of evidence for that. So you want to think about this rule as a scale or maybe a teeter-totter where boom, if you get crazy crazy claim, then you're going to need crazy evidence. That's the way to think about that. Here's a great clip of Carl Sagan explaining this much better than I do. If it makes sense, great. If it doesn't, that's okay too.
For all I know, we may be visited by a different extraterrestrial civilization every second Tuesday. But there's no support for this appealing idea. The extraordinary claims are not supported by extraordinary evidence.
There are curious daylight photos of UFOs. Some look suspiciously like hats or hubcaps thrown into the air. photos can be faked. More common are unidentified lights at night. They're often aircraft, but if we can't identify a light, that doesn't make it a spaceship. Here's a movie of what you might think is a UFO. Actually, it's a piece of an asteroid burning up as it enters the Earth's atmosphere.
Most reports of unidentified flying objects turn out to be something else, like the refracted image of a bright planet or the re-entry of an artificial satellite. Some are psychological aberrations, some are hoaxes. Never is there any compelling physical evidence, a detailed close-up photograph of a strange spacecraft or a small device of extraterrestrial manufacture, or a book written in alien hieroglyphics. Never. There are reports of such things, but never the things themselves.
Okay, so quick rundown. With extraordinary claims, claims can be extraordinary because they're rare, because they're unusual, because they violate what we know about nature or our own experience, but we'll get to those things. And then remember, the crazier the claim, the better the evidence we need. So the kind of evidence is important here. There's something called anecdotal evidence, and that's just an anecdote. It's a story that someone tells. When that happens, we want to see if there's anything outside of the document or the story that can corroborate that story. So if I'm telling a story about flying to work, maybe you're going to need to see a flight log or something that I would have to fill out that day. Or you'd see a newspaper account from me about, oh gosh, Professor Vitt, this amazing Long Beach City College philosophy professor is capable of actually flying to work, and he's going to solve our energy crisis or something like that, right? You want independent people who are also witness to this claim. The story itself isn't going to be enough, right? Just like in the case where I was talking about flying to work, and I'm going like that, right? You say, well, that's just not possible, right? I'm going to actually need to see that. And even if you did see it, you probably still wouldn't believe it. Okay. All right. We'll get into why certain kinds of evidence are better than others, but just off the top of your head, think about this. The evidence for trees, for the existence of trees, for the fact that trees exist is really good because any one of us can go out and look for a tree at any one time. And so it's not really very controversial whether or not there are trees. But if there are other claims that I can't verify, like somebody miraculously flying to work in some Jedi fashion, well, then I'm going to need something that I can investigate in order to evaluate that. In the case of this wrecking ball, we actually see an article from July the 19th, 1973. So actually, this is 2 years. I was just almost 2 years before I was born. So now, finding a newspaper account doesn't make it true, but it makes it interesting. It could, in fact, it lends a little bit of credibility to it. Okay, next up, let's take a peek at, so we're here at extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Let's take a peek at Occam. Okay, Occam's razor is a very, very fancy name for saying the simplest explanation is the best. So I'm going to talk about this in greater detail in a lecture, but the general idea is, suppose you're sitting in your house, you hear the sound of hooves, and you say, oh my gosh, that must be a horse, right? But then it turns out, oh no, it's a zebra. It wasn't a horse at all. It was this beautiful zebra. Well, what you're doing there is you're saying, look, I'm going to go for the most simple explanation of this sound of hooves. I'm going to go for horses because there are more horses around here. If we were living in, the Ivory Coast or somewhere in Africa, we would probably be inclined to think that those sounds were zebra sounds. Occam's razor doesn't always lead you to the truth, so it's not a slam dunk, but it does help you in making decisions, and it's something that you use all the time to some degree anyway now. All right, so oftentimes Occam's razor is something that it's an explanation for something that we already know exists. So in the case of this wrecking ball, we would say, well, look, we know for a fact that there were employees at this place. What's more miraculous? An alien comes down and takes the wrecking ball, or one of the employees stole it because he had keys to the crane and he had even borrowed equipment from the site to transport the thing 3 hours away where the cops would never find it, brought the whole thing back by morning and pretended that was that, right? That would be an application of Occam's razor, because I don't need to really appeal to anything that we don't know whether it exists or not, right? We know that there were workers. We knew that someone had keys to the crane, so someone must have done that, right? Okay. Reduction to the absurd. Okay. So this is so let's move on. Let me show you where we are here in our little... Okay, so we've gone here to Occam. Now we're going to go to what's called the reductio. It's a reduction to the absurd. What you're doing is you're saying, well, look, take this claim and push it all the way. Are there any ridiculous consequences? Sorry that text is interrupted there by the arrow. What that means is, suppose that I say, let me just back up here for a second before I rush into it. Think of when pigs fly, right? When somebody says that, for instance, I might say to my wife something like, hey, I'm going to go out, for the night and go have a wild time, and, you watch all the boys and tough stuff, right? Then she might say something like, well, when pigs fly, like, that's not going to happen, right? And that little expression is actually a really important insight into critical thinking. The idea is, look, suppose what you're saying is true, right? What must also be true if your claim is true? So the thing about the wrecking ball that is strange is that it appears as though the wrecking ball has vanished without any trace whatsoever. And so, what would also have to be true? Well, someone or something would have had to conceal the object. Someone would have had to move it some great distance. Someone must have had to evade the object to avoid detection. Someone probably sold it or used it later in a manner that itself was not detectable, right? So even if this was a close-knit community of construction workers in Indianapolis at the time, whoever sold this wrecking ball ended up keeping it quiet despite the fact that contractors were very close and so forth. Now, there's really not any ridiculous claim that comes around when you assume there's no straightforward reductio for the, Okay, let's talk about this pig, right? A reduction to the absurd. In order to talk about this pig just a little bit, I'm going to need to change the example that I'm working with. And instead of working with the wrecking ball, I want to talk about a conspiracy theory, supposing that someone, that we never went to the moon, right? That it was all a fake, a hoax. And there are people who maintain this position. To be sure, they're in the minority. And to the extent that I've heard debates on the subject, I've never heard a conspiracist make the sufficient claim. But suppose someone makes this argument, right? You have to be open to the idea. Suppose we didn't go to the moon. Okay, well, what would that mean? It would mean, if it's true that we never went to the moon, what also would have to be true? So the idea is, if we didn't go to the moon and the whole thing was a hoax, then several thousand people who worked on this rocket ship to the moon, right, Apollo or whichever mission it was, people who worked on this mission were in on it the whole time. And that seems ridiculous, right? It seems like you have so many thousands of people. You'd either have to fool all of them, which itself would be very difficult, right? It would be a ridiculous outcome. Or they're all in on the hoax. That seems very unlikely. Think about the times in your life you've really needed to keep a secret. Secrets have a way of messing up. Also, you'd have to have a really bizarre result. Suppose you'd still buy it and you'd say, look, I could believe that many people could keep a secret. You'd have to also explain the existence of seismic detection equipment that we left up on the moon. So way back in the 60s, we left some equipment on the moon, and it's not a lot, but it sends back seismic data, which is then useful to, I think, meteorologists or something like that. Well, this data has been being sent for decades now, and in order to sustain the claim that the moon landing was a hoax, was a conspiracy, you would have to maintain that someone's been faking all that seismic data for all this time, and that just, it strains credibility, right? It just seems like that's crazy because people use this data. They've been using it for a long time, and if the data was bad, we would have known, right? Because it would have shown up. Okay. So next up we have the teapot. Okay, here's the teapot. And the teapot is really just a marker for us saying, has the burden of proof been met? Meaning, has the claim been established? Have we proven what we wanted to prove? Has the person making the claim proven what they wanted to do? So, this happens very often when you might be talking about, suppose we're continuing discussion of faking the moon landing. And suppose I say, maybe I haven't proven to you that there was a conspiracy, but it's still possible that there's a conspiracy, right? You haven't proven me wrong, Professor Vitt. I can still say that it's a possibility, and I can still maintain my belief in it. In response to that, I would say, well, the question isn't what's possible, right? I mean, certainly I would grant it's possible that someone faked the hoax. I mean, that's definitely possible. But what reasons are there for thinking that it's true, right? It's possible that there's some type of government conspiracy involving 9/11. There's nothing ridiculous about the claim. But the question is not whether or not it's possible. The question is whether or not there's enough evidence to demonstrate the claim that you're making, right? You can't just make an unfounded assertion and say, oh my gosh, there was this conspiracy to knock down the World Trade Center or whatever. You have to provide evidence in support of your claim. The person who makes a claim needs to back it up with evidence, right? So when I say to, someone who's arguing a conspiracy for the moon landing, and they say, it's still possible that we didn't go. And I'd say, well, sure, it's still possible that we didn't go, but you have not met this burden of proof that requires that you substantiate your claim. You back up your claim, right? And because you haven't backed it up, it doesn't mean that you're wrong. I'm not saying that there is no conspiracy for 9/11. I'm not saying in this conversation there's no conspiracy to land on the moon. I'm just saying the burden of proof that is required, you haven't met it yet. You may be right? Maybe we didn't land on the moon. Maybe there was a 9/11 conspiracy. Who knows? I don't know. But just because you haven't met the burden of proof doesn't mean that you're wrong, right? So if somebody met a burden of proof, you say, yay, the claim has been established. But if somebody has not met the burden, then you'd say, well, the claim could still be true, so I'm not going to deny it, but I'm just going to say we don't know, right? Just because a claim can't be proven wrong doesn't mean that there are positive reasons to believe it, right? A claim could certainly be possible, but there are good reasons to believe but there are not good reasons to believe it because the claim hasn't been demonstrated yet. Look, there may be green monsters living in this basement. It's definitely possible. But if someone makes that claim, they're going to have a heavy burden of proof. And if they haven't met the burden of proof that there are green monsters down here, I'm not going to say, well, you're totally wrong. I'm just going to say, you haven't met your burden yet. I'm going to say that I don't think there's anything, but I would acknowledge I don't know, right? And that it would still be possible. Okay, I'm hoping that has been a little bit helpful. It's a short little video, but hopefully it gives you some loose ends as you start the other sections of the lecture. Okay, you guys, I hope that was super helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send me an email or something like that. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys soon.